Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey into a part of history that's often whispered about but rarely explored in full, a subject as vast and untamed as the landscape it emerged from. We're going to pull back the curtain on the man whose name alone strikes fear and awe into the hearts of millions, Genghis Khan. But we're not focusing on his battles and his strategies. Oh no, we're delving into the intimate, often terrifying and deeply complex world of his sexual practices. You'll be right there, shivering in the cold wind, feeling the dust on your face, as we explore a man whose personal life was just as much a tool of conquest as his legendary cavalry. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, at least not emotionally, because what we're about to uncover challenges every modern notion of consent, power and family. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're feeling extra cozy, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it a little magical to think about all of us, scattered across the globe, sharing this quiet moment together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture it. You're trudging across a landscape that seems to go on forever, a boundless sea of brown and green beneath a sky that feels impossibly huge. The wind, a constant sharp companion, whips at your clothes and tugs at your hair. This is the Mongolian steppe, a place of stark beauty and even starker hardship. To understand Genghis Khan, you have to first understand the world that forged him. It wasn't a world of soft beds and warm hearths. It was a world of survival, where every sunrise was a victory and every winter a potential grave. The nomadic tribes of the 12th century lived a life of constant motion, following their herds, their existence a brutal dance with nature. This relentless struggle for survival bred a culture that valued strength, endurance, and practicality above all else. Emotions, especially the softer ones, were a luxury they simply couldn't afford. It's an environment that makes a person incredibly tough, and if you can believe it, a little bit cynical. The idea of love, as we know it today, was a foreign concept, a soft-bellied weakness. Marriage was a transaction, a way to forge alliances or consolidate power. It was a business arrangement, a pact of survival, sealed not with a ring and a kiss, but with shared resources and the promise of future progeny. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The social structure of the nomadic tribes was fiercely hierarchical and patriarchal. The clan was everything, and the men at its head held absolute power, not just over their warriors but over their families. A woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear strong sons, to manage the household, and to endure the same hardships as the men. You see, the women weren't just decorative, they were essential cogs in the survival machine, setting up the yurts, managing the livestock and raising the next generation of warriors. Their lives were filled with back-breaking labour, and their value was intrinsically tied to their function within this brutal society. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Mongols had a fascinating, if somewhat brutal, method of courtship. A young man might ride to the camp of the woman he desired, and if her family approved, he would be challenged to a wrestling match. Not a friendly one, mind you. If he won, he would be considered strong enough to protect her and provide for her. If he lost, well, he'd probably be leaving with a few bruises and his tail between his legs. It's an odd and rather direct way of proving your worth, isn't it? Like a primitive version of a dating app profile picture showing you bench pressing a car. This wasn't about romance, it was about demonstrating physical capability, which was the ultimate currency in their world. Historians still argue whether the concept of chivalry, as we understand it, with its notions of protecting women and treating them with special reverence, ever existed on the steppe. The evidence suggests a much more utilitarian and transactional view of relationships. A woman was a prize, a spoil of war, a diplomatic tool. Her feelings were, for the most part, an afterthought. This wasn't a world of romantic love, it was a world of pragmatic necessity. The men needed to secure their bloodlines and their alliances, and the women were the means to that end. It was all so very sensible, in a horrifying kind of way. You can almost feel the chill in the air, can't you? The silence of the vast plains, broken only by the wind and the distant bleating of sheep. It's in this harsh environment, this constant struggle, that Genghis Khan, or Temujin as he was then known, was born. He didn't come from a position of immense privilege either. His father was a minor chieftain, and after his father's death, his family was cast out, left to fend for themselves in the wilderness. This experience of abject poverty and betrayal would forever shape his character. He learned early on that the world was not a forgiving place, and that power was the only true shield against suffering. He learned to be ruthless, to trust no one outside his immediate family, and to see every person, every relationship, as a potential weapon or a potential threat. And as we'll see, this worldview didn't stop at the battlefield. It seeped into the most intimate parts of his life, turning his marriages and his conquests into one and the same thing. So, you're standing on that endless steppe, the dust in your lungs, the wind biting at your skin. You're beginning to understand that the man who would one day command the largest land empire in history was shaped not by romance or sentiment, but by the cold, hard logic of survival. The relationships he would forge, both in war and in his personal life, were born of this grim necessity. And you might think to yourself, well, that's just how things were back then. But as we go deeper, you'll see that Genghis Khan elevated this brutal practicality to a whole new, almost terrifying level. He wasn't just a product of his environment, he was its ultimate expression, a man who saw every aspect of life, including the most personal and private, as a strategic game. His relationships were not just transactional, they were tools of domination, designed to break his enemy's will and to secure his own legacy for generations to come. So, breathe in that dry, dusty air. Feel the weight of this world on your shoulders. You've only just begun your journey. You're standing there on the edge of the vast plains, and the wind has a new story to whisper in your ear. It's a story not of battle, but of betrayal, and it begins with a name: Berta. She was the young woman who would become Genghis Khan's first wife, and their union, arranged in childhood, was supposed to be a cornerstone of his young life. Imagine a brief moment of peace, a tiny island of tradition, in a sea of chaos. You see a young Temujin, still not yet the Khan, riding to claim his bride. She's the daughter of a chieftain, and their marriage is meant to cement an alliance. It's a moment of hope, a fragile promise of a future. But on the Mongolian steppe, promises, like life, are fleeting things. This leads us to a crucial mainstream historical fact. The abduction of Berta was a pivotal event in Genghis Khan's life. It wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a profound humiliation. Shortly after their wedding, a rival tribe, the Merkits, raided their camp. They weren't just looking for cattle, they were looking to settle an old score. The Merkits had a history with Temujin's family, and by taking his new wife, they were delivering a message of utter contempt. You can almost feel the cold dread as you witness it. The chaos of the raid, the shouts of the Merkits, the frantic scramble to escape. Temujin manages to flee on horseback, but he is forced to leave Berta behind. She is taken, a prize of war, and given as a wife to one of the Merkit warriors. The shock of this event would echo throughout his life and fundamentally alter his view on relationships and the treatment of women in conquest. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Merkits' motive for kidnapping Berta was rooted in a historical grievance. Centuries earlier, Temujin's great-grandfather had abducted a woman from the Merkit tribe. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a sort of tit-for-tat revenge, a chilling example of how the sins of the fathers were literally visited upon the children. It's like a family feud that has been simmering for generations, only instead of passive-aggressive comments at a holiday dinner, they use abductions and raids. This detail adds a layer of grim, cyclical karma to the story, showing that Temujin was as much a victim of this brutal culture as he was its master. It wasn't a spontaneous act, it was the chilling fulfillment of an old deep-seated grudge. Historians still argue whether Temujin's eventual obsession with conquering and subjugating rival tribes was a direct result of this humiliation, or if it was simply a convenient justification for his pre-existing ambition. Did the personal trauma of Berta's abduction fuel his relentless drive for conquest, turning it into a crusade for vengeance? Or was it just a convenient excuse, a way to rally his men and give their brutal raids a noble-sounding purpose? It's a fascinating debate. Was the greatest conqueror in history motivated by cold, calculated ambition, or a burning personal desire for revenge? Perhaps it was both, a perfect storm of personal trauma and political opportunity. You see Temujin, a young man, a newlywed, forced to swallow this bitter pill of defeat. He didn't have the power to stop the abduction. He didn't have the forces to immediately pursue his enemies. For months, Berta was gone. Her absence was a wound, not just to his heart, but to his pride and his standing among the tribes. The inability to protect his own wife, to secure his own home, was a public demonstration of his weakness. It was a failure he would never forget, and it would shape his every future action. He would never again allow himself to be in a position of such vulnerability. From that moment on, his relationships, his marriages, and even his sexual encounters would be inextricably linked to power, control, and domination. Months later, with the help of a rival chieftain, Temujin finally had the forces he needed to launch a rescue mission. The raid was a success, and he was reunited with Berta. But the time she spent with the Merkits had changed everything. She was pregnant. When she gave birth to a son, Yochi, the paternity was immediately in question. Temujin, in a remarkable show of loyalty and pragmatism, accepted the boy as his own. But the seed of doubt, of uncertainty, had been planted. It would be a source of tension and rivalry among his sons for years, a dark shadow cast by that initial trauma. You can imagine the heavy silence in the yurt after Yochi's birth, the unspoken question hanging in the air. This was the ultimate test of Temujin's character, and his decision to accept Yochi was a pragmatic masterstroke, a way of signalling to his followers that he valued loyalty and continuity above all else. But that doubt remained. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about? Think of this as the emotional equivalent, something strange and a little off-putting that became a part of the fabric of their lives. So you're standing in the cold, feeling the weight of this broken vow. You're beginning to understand that the man who would become Genghis Khan was not just a great military strategist. He was a product of his experiences. The abduction of his wife taught him a lesson he would never forget. That women were not just partners or wives, but strategic assets. They were a measure of a man's power, and their capture was the ultimate humiliation. This event, this single act of vengeance by a rival tribe, transformed his personal life into an extension of his military campaign. The intimate became the political. From this point forward, when he took a wife, whether by alliance or by force, it was a declaration of his power, a sign that he would never again be so vulnerable. The fear of repeating that moment, of losing what he held dear, would fuel his conquests and shape his terrifying approach to the spoils of war. He learned that to be truly powerful, he had to control not just the land and the people, but the very essence of their lives, their families and their future. The rescue of Berta was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a terrifying new chapter, a chapter in which the most intimate of human relationships became another battlefield. The air on the steppe feels heavier now, doesn't it? The taste of dust has been replaced by the acrid scent of smoke and the coppery tang of spilled blood. We've left the world of personal vendettas and entered the grand, terrifying theatre of Mongol conquest. You're no longer an observer. You're on the move with the Mongol cavalry, a part of the relentless galloping storm that is sweeping across Eurasia. As you ride alongside them, you start to see the unspoken rules of this new world order, and they are as chilling as the winter winds. The most profound rule, the one that governs everything, is this. When the Mongols conquered a city, a tribe, or a kingdom, everything within it became their property, and that included the people. The spoils of war were not just gold and silk and horses. They were also the men, women and children of the defeated. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The Mongols' approach to conquered peoples was systematic and brutal. Upon taking a city, a detailed census would be conducted. The skilled artisans, engineers and scholars would be spared and absorbed into the empire, their talents put to use for the benefit of the Khan. The beautiful and high-status women would be taken to be given as wives or concubines to the Mongol leaders and their generals. The rest of the population, the ordinary people, were often massacred or used as human shields in the next siege. This wasn't a random act of savagery, it was a cold, calculated strategy. It was a form of psychological warfare, designed to break the will of any future resistance. The message was clear: submit, and you might live to serve. Resist, and you will be annihilated, and your daughters will be taken. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The Mongols had a fascinating and deeply disturbing way of organising their captives. The women were often sorted by a simple but brutal process, a kind of primitive draft. The most beautiful and high-born women were set aside for the Khan himself and his sons. The next tier would be allocated to the generals and nobles. The remainder, the vast majority, would be distributed among the common soldiers. It was a formal, almost bureaucratic system of human allocation. Imagine a battlefield littered with the dead, and the Mongols, not just collecting loot, but calmly, efficiently, sorting through the living survivors as if they were livestock. It's a chilling image, a perfect example of how the Mongols' pragmatism extended even to the most personal and intimate of human relationships. There was no romance, no courtship, only acquisition and distribution. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of these practices was purely a result of military necessity, or if it was also a reflection of a deeper cultural belief that the Mongols were a superior people, destined to rule over all others. Was this simply a means to an end, a way to terrorize enemies into submission and to provide for a growing army? Or was there a profound sense of entitlement at play? The debate is whether this was a tool of war or a fundamental aspect of their worldview. It's hard to separate the two. A culture forged in constant struggle would naturally see the world in terms of dominance and submission. The act of taking a woman from a conquered tribe wasn't just about satisfying desire. It was a profound act of asserting dominance. It was a public statement, a symbolic consummation of their victory, a final act of humiliation for the defeated. You can almost feel the weight of this new reality pressing down on you. You're seeing the brutal aftermath of a siege, the smoke still curling into the sky. The Mongol soldiers, their faces impassive, are moving through the streets. You see a woman, her clothes torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She's being led away, not with an act of violence, but with a kind of grim efficiency, as if she were just another piece of captured equipment. Her story, and the stories of thousands like her, would never be told in the grand chronicles of the empire. They were the silent footnotes to Genghis Khan's legacy, the human cost of his relentless ambition. He was building an empire, and every woman he took, whether by alliance or by force, became a living brick in that empire's foundation. Remember Berta, the wife he lost and reclaimed? The experience of her abduction taught him a hard lesson, that to be a true conqueror, you must not only defeat your enemies on the battlefield, but you must also possess everything they hold dear. And for a patriarchal society, there was nothing more valuable, nothing more symbolic of power than the women of a defeated people. He wasn't just collecting wives, he was collecting power, one woman at a time. Each new wife, each new concubine, was a living testament to a new conquest, a new kingdom brought under his thumb. The harem wasn't a place of idle pleasure, it was a political map of his empire, a living record of his victories. And the irony, the dark humour of it all, is that these women, these symbols of his power, also became his greatest vulnerability. They brought with them not only the chance for new alliances, but also the potential for conspiracy, for revenge, for a silent, unseen rebellion from within his own household. The very women who were meant to solidify his power could also be the agents of his downfall. The grand stage of Genghis Khan's empire was a dangerous place, and the women he took were not simply passive figures. They were active, sometimes unwilling, participants in the great bloody drama of his reign. You're seeing a world where the personal is the political, and the most intimate of acts is a declaration of war. The wind is picking up now, carrying with it the scent of distant silk and foreign spices. We've left the dusty battlefields and entered a world of whispered secrets and calculated alliances. You're no longer just a spectator. You're moving through the imperial camps of Genghis Khan, a sprawling city of yurts that stretches for miles. This isn't just a home. It's the nerve centre of an empire, and at its heart lies the Khan's personal world, a place known as the harem. But this isn't the romanticised, perfumed enclosure of a sultan's court you might be imagining. For Genghis Khan, his collection of wives and concubines was not a place of idle pleasure. It was a complex and vital part of his strategy, a living, breathing geopolitical tool. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Genghis Khan's marriages were almost exclusively political. He rarely, if ever, married for love after his initial union with Berta. Each wife, each concubine, was acquired from a different tribe or kingdom, and her presence in his household was a public and permanent sign of a new alliance or a recent conquest. For instance, after conquering the Merkits, he took a Merkit princess as a concubine. This was a deliberate act, a way of not just humiliating the defeated tribe, but of literally absorbing them into his own bloodline. When he took a wife from the Tangut people, it was a symbolic act of alliance. His harem was a miniature map of his empire, with each woman representing a different conquered or allied territory. It was a way of consolidating power, of showing the world that these disparate peoples were now all under the sway of one man. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the hierarchy within this harem was incredibly strict, and was based on the social status of the woman's home tribe. Women from allied or prestigious tribes held a much higher rank than those from conquered and less powerful ones. These high-status wives, known as khatun, had their own personal yurts, servants, and even a degree of political influence. A captured slave, no matter how beautiful, would never be able to reach the same status as a khatun. This wasn't a meritocracy of beauty or affection. It was a rigid social structure based entirely on the political landscape. The power dynamic within his private life mirrored the power dynamics of his burgeoning empire. Imagine the silent, simmering rivalries within this world, where a simple shift in a political alliance could mean a promotion or a demotion for a woman and her children. Historians still argue whether the khatun truly wielded political power in their own right, or if they were merely conduits for their husbands' wishes and strategies. Did these high-ranking wives, with their separate courts and considerable resources, actively influence policy and succession, or were their actions a performance, a carefully orchestrated illusion of power? The evidence is often circumstantial, a series of mentions in ancient chronicles about a certain wife interceding on behalf of her people or a son. But the lack of a clear record leaves room for debate. Were they truly advisors, or just prestigious pawns in a very large, very dangerous chess game? The lack of documentation from a nomadic society makes it difficult to say for sure, but the very existence of the debate suggests that their role was more than just ceremonial. You can picture it, can't you? You're walking through the sprawling camp, and you see the yurts of the different wives, each one subtly different, a reflection of her origin. One might be adorned with silks from the west, another with intricate carvings from the east. The very layout of the camp is a physical representation of Genghis Khan's power, a testament to his reach. But beneath the veneer of order and opulence there's a quiet tension. The women of the harem were not friends, they were rivals. Their sons, in particular, were raised with an acute awareness of their lineage and the intense competition for their father's favour. The battle for succession didn't begin after Genghis Khan's death. It was waged daily, in the very heart of his family. Remember the first wife, Berthe. She was a khatun, and her sons were considered the primary heirs. But what of the women who were taken from conquered cities, their names lost to history? Their children would have a different, more tenuous claim on power. Genghis Khan was a master of using these social and familial dynamics to his advantage, keeping his potential rivals, even his own children, in a constant state of competition. It was a brilliant, if brutal, way of ensuring that no single person could rise to challenge his authority. The harem, far from being a place of passive women, was a cauldron of political ambition, a hotbed of intrigue and rivalries that would shape the future of the Mongol Empire for generations. And in a darkly humorous way, Genghis Khan's personal life was the ultimate example of a multicultural society. He had women and children from across his vast empire living in close proximity, a forced experiment in globalization. But this wasn't about celebrating diversity, it was about possession, a way of proving that all these people, all these cultures, were now under his absolute control. The physical presence of a woman from a conquered kingdom was a living symbol of his victory, a constant silent reminder to his enemies that he had not only defeated them, but had taken their most valuable prize. You're beginning to see that in Genghis Khan's world, the act of a man taking a woman was never just about a relationship. It was always, without exception, an act of power, and he had an insatiable appetite for both. The wind on the steppe carries with it the sound of horses and the hum of a bustling camp, but now a different kind of sound is mixed in, the hushed whispers of intrigue. We're deep within the royal camp, and you're starting to see beyond the grand tents and the military displays. You're getting a glimpse into the inner world of Genghis Khan's court, and it's a place where alliances are forged and broken with a word, and where power is as much a weapon as a sword. Within this glittering, opulent world of silk and felt, the competition among the women of the harem was not just for Genghis Khan's attention, it was a deadly game of political survival. This leads us to a mainstream historical fact. The royal court of Genghis Khan was a hotbed of rivalries and betrayals. While the Mongols are often romanticized as a unified, single-minded force, The reality was a constant struggle for influence and power among the leading families and the different wives. Each of the Khatun, the high-ranking wives, had their own separate household, their own network of servants, and their own political agendas. They vied for the best grazing lands for their herds, the most valuable gifts from the Khan, and most importantly, they jockeyed to ensure that their sons would be in a position to inherit power. This wasn't a passive competition. It was an active, ruthless struggle for supremacy, waged with cunning, manipulation, and sometimes even poison. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The wives and concubines were not just rivals, they were also masters of subtle communication. Since direct confrontation with a high-status rival was dangerous, they would often use intermediaries, servants, eunuchs, or even other family members to send coded messages and warnings. A gift of a piece of jewellery could be a show of respect or a veiled insult, depending on its history and its symbolism. A shared meal could be a peace offering or a subtle attempt at poisoning. It's like a high-stakes historical version of a passive-aggressive social media feud, but with actual life or death consequences. The women in the court had to be as politically savvy as the men, able to read the subtle signals and navigate a complex web of loyalty and betrayal. Historians still argue whether the poisonings and betrayals documented in later Persian and Chinese chronicles were a common occurrence or simply sensationalized tales designed to portray the Mongols as barbaric. Were the accounts of rival wives secretly poisoning each other's children a frequent reality of court life, or were these isolated incidents blown out of proportion by chroniclers eager to add drama to their narratives? The nomadic nature of the Mongols means there are no detailed court records, no diaries to consult. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, but the fact that these stories were told at all suggests that such treachery was not entirely out of the realm of possibility. The constant tension and intense competition would have made such acts a tempting, if risky, way to get ahead. You can almost feel the stifling air inside a royal yurt, the tension palpable despite the outward show of harmony. You see a woman, a Khatun from a proud, conquered tribe. She's outwardly deferential, her face a mask of calm, but her eyes are sharp, calculating. She's watching every move, every gesture of the wife from a rival family. Her son, her only hope for a future, is playing nearby, and she's acutely aware of the dangers he faces. Remember the story of the crocodile dung sunscreen? This is the emotional equivalent, a strange, unsettling reality that you're constantly aware of. The love of a mother in this environment was not a soft, nurturing thing. It was a fiercely protective, almost militaristic force, a shield against a world of silent daggers and hidden intentions. And this environment of ruthless ambition was not just a side effect of Genghis Khan's polygamous life. It was an intentional part of his strategy. By pitting his wives and their sons against each other, he ensured that no single faction could become powerful enough to challenge his own authority. He kept his potential rivals in a state of constant competition, a brilliant, if brutal, way of maintaining control. He didn't just rule an empire, he ruled a family, and he did it with the same brutal pragmatism he used on the battlefield. The royal court was the ultimate test of survival, a place where a woman's worth was determined not by her beauty or her kindness, but by her cunning and her ability to navigate a world of political intrigue. The women of the royal court, far from being passive possessions, were active agents in this drama. They were mothers, advisors, and political schemers, their lives a complex blend of duty and ambition. They understood that their own survival, and more importantly the survival of their children, depended entirely on their ability to outmaneuver their rivals. The lavish silks and the golden ornaments were a beautiful veneer over a deeply ugly reality. The stories of betrayals, of poisonings, and of quiet assassinations were the dark secrets whispered in the cold steppe winds. And while we may never know the full truth, we know enough to understand that the royal court of Genghis Khan was a dangerous, fascinating place, where the most personal relationships were just another battlefield in a war for ultimate power. The Wind has a new message for you now, one that speaks not of rivalry, but of legacy. You're walking among the yurts of Genghis Khan's camp, and you're beginning to understand that while the women were at the heart of the court's intrigues, the true prize was not their power, but the blood that flowed through their children's veins. For Genghis Khan, his bloodline was more than just a family. It was the sacred, tangible proof of his divine mandate to rule the world. The purpose of every wife and concubine, in his eyes, was to produce sons who would carry this legacy forward, and that singular, all-encompassing purpose shaped every aspect of their existence. This leads us to a mainstream historical fact. The continuity and purity of the Mongol bloodline were considered paramount. In a culture with no written constitution or clear line of succession, the legitimacy of a ruler was often tied directly to his lineage. A son's claim to power was based on his mother's status, his own abilities, and most importantly on his undeniable connection to Genghis Khan. The women were under immense pressure to produce male heirs. Failure to do so could mean a loss of status, a diminished future for their clan, and a blow to the family's prestige. This wasn't just a matter of personal desire, it was a matter of statecraft. A fertile wife was a valuable asset. A barren one was a political liability. The very future of the empire depended on the next generation of Khans. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the Mongols had a fascinating if brutal system for dealing with the issue of succession. When a new Khan was to be chosen, the sons of the primary wives would gather to hold a Kurultai, a great council. However, the order of succession was not always based on age. The most capable son, regardless of his birth order, was often chosen. This created an intense, lifelong competition between the half-brothers, all of whom had a legitimate, if sometimes tenuous, claim to the throne. It's like a deadly version of a corporate leadership race, where the winner gets the empire and the losers might get a swift end or a life in exile. This system of meritocratic succession was both a strength and a weakness, ensuring that a strong leader would always rise to the top, but also guaranteeing a constant state of internal friction and civil war. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan's acceptance of Yochi, the son of Berta whose paternity was in question, was a genuine act of paternal love or a cold, calculated move to maintain political stability. Did he truly believe Yoshi was his son, or did he simply see that acknowledging him was the most pragmatic way to avoid a family schism and potential civil war early in his rise to power? The fact that the debate over Yoshi's paternity continued for generations, even leading to internal conflicts, suggests that this decision was a complex one, with both personal and political motivations. It's a key example of how Genghis Khan's personal life and his political ambitions were inextricably linked. The question of a single child's lineage could threaten the stability of an entire empire. You can almost feel the weight of this expectation on the shoulders of these women. You see a young wife, recently taken from a conquered city, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. She understands, in a way that transcends language, that her entire future, her very survival, depends on her ability to bear a son for the Khan. The pressure is suffocating. In this world, a woman's body was not her own. It was a vessel for the continuation of a dynasty. And the children she bore were not just hers. They were the future of an empire, the living proof of Genghis Khan's sacred destiny. The stories of women who failed to produce a male heir are lost to history. But you can imagine the quiet tragedies, the personal anguish of a life deemed a failure because of a biological inability. Remember the harem we talked about? Think of it now not as a place of pleasure, but as a breeding ground, a laboratory for the creation of an imperial bloodline. The women were the subjects, and the Khan was the master biologist, ensuring that the strongest and most suitable genes were passed down. And in a darkly humorous way, his strategy was a success beyond his wildest dreams. The modern scientific studies we will discuss later confirm that his genetic legacy is vast, a silent testament to the sheer scale of his procreation. He didn't just conquer lands, he colonized the human genome. The immense pressure on these women to not just survive but to produce and protect their male offspring created a unique and powerful class of women within the empire. They were the matriarchs, the guardians of the bloodline, and their influence, while often hidden, was immense. They were not just mothers, they were power brokers, their every move calculated to secure a future for their sons. The sacred purpose of the bloodline elevated them from mere possessions to something far more significant, the living conduits of an imperial legacy. Their quiet struggles, their hidden ambitions, and their fierce protectiveness over their children were all part of the grand, silent drama of Genghis Khan's empire. You're beginning to see that the most intimate parts of his life were the ones that held the greatest power, the ones that would ultimately shape the future of a continent. The wind is no longer just a cold companion, it's a storyteller, and the tales it carries now are not of grand conquests, but of quiet, simmering vengeance. You're no longer just a spectator, You're moving through the silent corners of Genghis Khan's camp, the places where the women, taken from their homes and forced into his service, live out their days. These women were not just passive figures in his story. Some were silent agents of resistance, their hearts filled with a burning desire for retribution against the man who had destroyed their lives. While he was busy conquering the world, he was creating enemies in the very heart of his own household. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Not all of the women taken by Genghis Khan submitted quietly. The chronicles, particularly those written by chroniclers from the conquered lands, contain stories of women who secretly plotted against the Khan and his empire. These acts of resistance were often subtle and dangerous, as a direct rebellion would be met with swift and brutal punishment. They range from subtle acts of sabotage, poisoning a meal, whispering a secret to a trusted servant, or using their influence to undermine a rival, to more audacious plots. These women, many of whom were high-born princesses or noblewomen, saw their forced marriages not as a sign of their defeat, but as a unique opportunity to infiltrate the enemy's inner circle. They were spies in silk, agents of chaos in a world of rigid order. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the more sensational, though difficult to verify stories tells of a captured princess who became a concubine to one of Genghis Khan's grandsons. She was so filled with hatred for the Mongols that she allegedly feigned affection for her new husband, slowly gaining his trust. Once she had his full confidence, she's said to have orchestrated a series of events that led to a major rebellion in her home region. She did this not by wielding a sword, but by using her knowledge of Mongol customs and her position to manipulate key figures and send coded messages to her people. It's a classic example of a woman using her wits and her unique position to strike a blow against her captors, a historical version of a spy thriller plot. Whether true or embellished, the story speaks to the deep, abiding resentment that many of these women must have harboured. Historians still argue whether the acts of vengeance attributed to these women were isolated incidents or part of a larger coordinated movement of resistance from within the harem. Were these women simply acting on their own personal grief and anger, or was there an informal network of communication among them, a silent sisterhood of the conquered? The lack of detailed records makes it impossible to know for sure. It's hard to imagine that in a camp filled with women from different conquered lands, they would not have found ways to communicate and share their stories, their pain, and their desire for revenge. But whether these acts were coordinated or simply individual acts of defiance, they highlight a critical vulnerability in Genghis Khan's system of conquest. He could control the land, but he could not control the human heart. You can almost feel the tension, the quiet fear that would have existed in the royal camp. You see a woman, her face a mask of calm as she prepares a meal for a high-ranking Mongol. You wonder what she's thinking. Is she secretly hoping for his downfall? Is she planning an escape? The stories of these women are often told through the lens of a male-dominated narrative, but if you listen closely, you can hear their silent screams of defiance. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, the strange and unsettling thing that became a part of their world? This is a different kind of strangeness. The quiet horror of a woman forced to live with her enemy, the man who destroyed everything she knew, and the burning desire for revenge that kept her alive. Genghis Khan, in his ruthless pragmatism, saw these women as political assets, but he failed to see the human cost of his actions. He failed to consider that by taking these women, he was bringing the seeds of his own destruction into his home. The women of his harem were not just silent possessions, they were a collective memory of the lands he had ravaged, the people he had slaughtered, and the homes he had burned. Their quiet presence was a constant living reminder of his brutality, and in their hearts, a fire of vengeance burned, a flame that would not be extinguished by lavish gifts or a high social status. The stories of these women are a powerful counter-narrative to the grand tales of Genghis Khan's military triumphs. They remind us that history is not just about the powerful men who shape it, but also about the silent, forgotten figures who are caught in its wake. The acts of vengeance, large and small, that these women committed were a testament to their strength, their resilience, and their refusal to be completely broken by their circumstances. They may have lost their homes, their families, and their freedom, but they did not lose their will to resist. In the heart of Genghis Khan's own world, a different kind of battle was being waged, a silent, deadly conflict of will and revenge. It was a battle he may have never even known he was fighting. The Wind on the Steppe whispers a different kind of story now, one that reveals another layer of Genghis Khan's ruthless pragmatism. It's a tale not of women taken, but of women given. His own daughters. You're no longer just a spectator. You're standing at the edge of his camp, watching a procession of horse-drawn carts and riders. But this isn't a raid or a military advance. It's a wedding party. And at its centre is one of Genghis Khan's daughters, on her way to an arranged marriage with a foreign king or prince. For the Khan, his daughters were not just beloved family members. They were strategic assets, the ultimate diplomatic tool, used to expand his influence without a single battle. This leads us to a mainstream historical fact. Genghis Khan had a sophisticated and deeply cynical policy of using his daughters for political gain. He would marry them to the rulers of powerful allied kingdoms. However, this was not a simple alliance. The condition of the marriage was always the same. The foreign king had to divorce his other wives to take Genghis Khan's daughter as his primary wife. After the marriage, the son-in-law would be dispatched to a far-off and often dangerous military front with his new bride in tow. The son-in-law was then expected to lead the Mongol forces in conquest, serving as a human shield and an expendable pawn in the Khan's grand strategy. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the Mongols referred to this practice as the androgenization of the bloodlines. It wasn't just about creating alliances, it was a clever way of weakening a rival kingdom from within. By forcing a ruler to divorce his existing wives, Genghis Khan was disrupting that kingdom's line of succession. His daughter, now the primary wife, would have children who were a part of the Mongol bloodline, creating a new dynastic branch that was loyal to the Khan. If the son-in-law were to be killed in battle, a frequent occurrence given the dangerous fronts they were sent to, his son, the grandson of Genghis Khan, would inherit the throne, bringing that kingdom firmly under Mongol control. It's a brilliant, if utterly ruthless, piece of long-term political engineering. It's like a corporate takeover, but with family members and a much higher body count. Historians still argue whether the Mongol daughters were willing participants in this strategy, or if they were simply pawns in a patriarchal game. Did they see their marriages as a duty, a noble sacrifice for the good of the empire, or did they resent being used in such a cynical and dangerous way? The historical record is, as you might expect, silent on their personal feelings. There are no diaries or letters from these princesses lamenting their fate, but the fact that some of them went on to become powerful regents in their own right suggests that they were not just passive objects. They were intelligent, ambitious women who understood the game they were in and played it to their advantage. They became the power behind the thrones of their foreign husbands, and often, after their husbands' deaths, they ruled the kingdoms themselves. You can picture it, can't you? You're standing there, watching the lavish wedding procession leave the camp. You see the father, Genghis Khan, his face unreadable. Is he sad to see his daughter go? Or is he already calculating the political gain of this new alliance? And you see the daughter dressed in finery from a foreign land, her face a mask. Is she afraid? Or is she filled with a quiet sense of purpose, a knowledge that she is not just a bride, but a conqueror in her own right? The answers are lost to time, but the scene itself is a testament to the ruthless efficiency of the Mongol way of life. Every relationship, every family tie, was a tool to be used in the service of the empire. Remember the story of Berta and her abduction. That event taught Genghis Khan the humiliation of losing what was his. This practice of giving away his daughters was the logical extension of that lesson. By giving a part of himself, he was not losing control, but rather gaining a foothold in a new kingdom. He was turning a vulnerability, his family, into an impenetrable web of power. He wasn't just conquering lands, he was infiltrating dynasties, one family at a time. The marriages of his daughters were not about love or family, they were a form of biological warfare, a quiet, unseen conquest waged from the heart of his own household. And in a darkly humorous way, his daughters were more effective conquerors than many of his generals. They didn't have to fight a single battle or shed a drop of blood. All they had to do was survive their husbands, bear sons, and wait for the inevitable. The silent power of these women, their quiet resilience, and their ability to navigate and dominate foreign courts is one of the most remarkable and often overlooked aspects of the Mongol Empire's success. He didn't just have an army of men, he had an army of women, and their influence was perhaps even more lasting and pervasive. They were the silent architects of the largest land empire in history, and you, standing there, watching the procession disappear into the horizon, are beginning to see the true scale of Genghis Khan's ambition, an ambition that transcended battlefields and was woven into the very fabric of human relationships. The wind has a new song to sing now, one that speaks of a hidden power, a force that shaped the Mongol Empire from within. We've talked about the daughters given away and the wives taken, but we haven't yet truly explored the most profound aspect of Genghis Khan's personal life, the unseen influence of the women in his family. You're no longer just a spectator, you're moving through the heart of the empire, where the great decisions are made, and you're beginning to see that the hands that shaped the empire were not always those that wielded a sword. This leads us to a mainstream historical fact. The wives and daughters of Genghis Khan wielded significant, though often unwritten, political influence. In a nomadic culture where the men were frequently away on campaign for years at a time, the women were left to manage the vast households and the economic affairs of the clan. This gave them a practical power that transcended their official status. They were the ones who managed the finances, oversaw the herds, and maintained the diplomatic ties with other tribes. When Genghis Khan was away, it was his wives who were effectively in charge of the home front, making decisions that had a direct impact on the empire's stability. They were the silent administrators of a vast and growing state. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the Mongols had a fascinating tradition known as levirate marriage, where a woman would marry her deceased husband's brother or son. This practice was not just a social custom. It was a way of ensuring that the woman and her children remained within the family and that their wealth and property did not leave the clan. After Genghis Khan's death, some of his most powerful wives and concubines were inherited by his sons, an act that would be unthinkable in most other cultures. However, for the Mongols, it was a pragmatic way of preserving the bloodline and consolidating power. This practice, while deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities, allowed these women to maintain their influence and power within the next generation of leadership. It's a bit like a corporate merger, but with people instead of companies, and it highlights the Mongols' ruthless focus on practicality over emotion. Historians still argue whether the influence of these women was truly their own, or if it was merely an extension of the authority of their male relatives. Were they powerful in their own right, or did they only have power because they were the mothers, wives, or daughters of the Khan? The debate is whether they were truly independent agents or simply powerful conduits. The fact that some of these women, like Sorghaghtani Beki, the mother of two of Genghis Khan's grandsons, went on to become one of the most powerful and influential figures in the empire, suggests that their influence was far more than just ceremonial. She was a master of political manoeuvring, a kind of matriarchal puppet master, who ensured that her sons, rather than their rivals, would eventually rule. You can picture it, can't you? You're sitting in a yurt, the felt walls muffling the sounds of the outside world. Inside, you see a woman, a high-ranking Khatun, not on a throne but sitting on a simple rug. She's not giving orders to an army, but she's giving instructions to a messenger, her words carrying the weight of the Khan's authority. She's making decisions about trade routes, diplomatic negotiations, and the movement of vast herds of animals. She is the quiet power behind the throne, the woman who ensures that the empire continues to function while the men are away at war. It's a testament to the fact that power can be wielded in many ways, not just with a sword. Remember that Genghis Khan was a man of immense ambition, but he couldn't be everywhere at once. He relied on his family to manage the vast empire he was building, and he trusted the women in his life to handle the affairs of state that he couldn't. This trust, this reliance on their abilities, gave them a unique position of authority. Their power was not official, but it was very real. They were the ones who kept the home fires burning, who managed the vast economic engine of the empire, and who ensured that the next generation of rulers was ready to take the reins. The women of Genghis Khan's family were not just a reflection of his power, they were an essential part of it. Their influence was often subtle, but it was immense. They were the ones who raised the next generation of Khans, teaching them the ruthless pragmatism and the cold ambition that had made their father so successful. Their quiet work, their unseen influence was as much a part of the Mongol legacy as the thunder of the cavalry. They were the silent architects of an empire, and their story is a powerful reminder that history is not always what it seems on the surface. You're beginning to see that Genghis Khan's greatest conquest may have been in the bedroom, but the real power lay with the women he brought into his life. Their stories, though often forgotten, are an essential part of the tapestry of his reign. The wind is no longer just a whisper, it's a chorus, and it's singing the names of the women who didn't just survive in Genghis Khan's empire, but who thrived, wielding their power with a quiet ferocity that was just as effective as any cavalry charge. You've seen the harem as a political tool and the bloodline as a sacred purpose, but now you're going to meet the women who were not just pawns in the Khan's game, but players in their own right. These were the wives who, through cunning, intelligence, and sheer force of will, ruled the roost and shaped the destiny of the empire from within. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. While Genghis Khan's first and primary wife was Berta, he had several other influential wives who held significant power and status. The most notable among them was probably Yesui, a Tatar princess. After Genghis Khan defeated the Tatars, he took Yesui as a wife, not out of love, but out of a desire to cement his victory. However, Yesui was a remarkably shrewd and politically savvy woman. She quickly gained the Khan's trust and was known for her loyalty and her sharp political mind. She was not just a symbol of his conquest, she was an active partner in his rule, advising him on military and diplomatic matters. Her influence was so great that she was one of the few women who could speak to the Khan freely, and he would often consult her on matters of state. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The story of Yesugen, Yesui's sister, offers a fascinating glimpse into the complex social dynamics of the Mongol court. Yesui was so devoted to Genghis Khan that, fearing her own sister might be overlooked, she offered Yesugen to the Khan as a gift. The Khan, in a rare act of sentimentality, accepted and was reportedly very fond of Yesugen. This act, so unusual to modern sensibilities, was seen by the Mongols as an ultimate expression of loyalty and devotion. It also speaks to the intense competition among the wives, where even a gesture of generosity could be a calculated move to secure one's own position by elevating a trusted relative. It's a kind of family-based political manoeuvring that makes you realise how different their world was. Historians still argue whether the power of these wives was genuinely their own, or if it was granted to them by Genghis Khan as a strategic move to keep them loyal and to use their influence to control their home tribes. Did Genghis Khan genuinely see them as partners, or were they just an extension of his own power? The debate is whether he was a benevolent despot or a shrewd opportunist. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. He was a pragmatic man who understood that a happy, influential wife was far more useful than a rebellious one. By giving them power, he was not just rewarding them, he was also ensuring that they would be an integral part of his empire-building project. He was a master of using people's desires and ambitions to his own ends. You can almost feel the presence of these powerful women. You're sitting in a yurt and a woman enters, her face calm and her posture straight. She's not a silent figure in the background, she is a commanding presence, and the men in the room, even the hardened warriors, listen when she speaks. She's not giving a fiery speech. She is quietly, calmly, and with perfect logic, laying out a plan for a diplomatic mission. Her power is not physical, it's intellectual and political. She has a deep understanding of the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that makes up the empire, and she uses that knowledge to her advantage. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen? This is the intellectual equivalent, a strange and fascinating detail that reveals the true complexity of their world. These wives were not just influential, they were often the silent protectors of their people. They would use their positions to intercede on behalf of their home tribes, asking the Khan for clemency, for better trade deals, or for a more lenient tax policy. They were a bridge between the conquered and the conqueror, a vital channel of communication that helped to maintain the fragile peace of the empire. They were the ones who managed the cultural exchange, who ensured that the traditions of their people were not completely lost in the face of Mongol domination. The women of Genghis Khan's court were not just wives, they were diplomats, strategists, and administrators. Their power was often behind the scenes, a quiet force that moved the great levers of state. They were the ones who ensured that the empire, which was built on conquest and bloodshed, had a chance to survive and thrive. Their stories, though often overshadowed by the grand narratives of their male counterparts, are an essential part of the tapestry of Genghis Khan's reign. They remind us that history is not just made on the battlefield, but in the quiet, unseen spaces where true power is often found. And you, listening to this tale, are starting to see the true complexity of a man who is not just a warrior, but also a master of using the most personal of relationships to build the largest land empire in history. The wind has a new song for you now. one that is sombre and chilling, a counterpoint to the grand tales of conquest and power. We've talked about the political and strategic aspects of Genghis Khan's personal life, but now we must confront a darker reality: the immense human cost of his empire building, particularly for the women caught in his wake. You're no longer just a spectator, you're standing in the silent aftermath of a siege, and you're starting to see the true, terrifying toll of his sexual practices on the thousands of women whose stories are lost to history. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The Mongol Empire's expansion was built on a foundation of sexual violence. While Genghis Khan's official wives and high-status concubines were given a degree of power and protection, the vast majority of women from conquered territories were not so lucky. They were treated as spoils of war, their bodies a part of the loot. Mass rape was a common tactic used by the Mongol army, not as a random act of savagery, but as a deliberate tool of war. It was a form of psychological terror designed to break the will of the enemy and to erase their cultural identity. The message was clear: your men are defeated, your lands are taken, and your women are no longer your own. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the Mongols had a fascinating, if disturbing, practice known as kur, or the beautifying of a conquered city before it was destroyed. Before a city was put to the torch, the Mongols would systematically collect all the most valuable loot: gold, silk, weapons, and women. The women, particularly the highborn and beautiful ones, were often paraded through the streets before being taken to the Mongol camps. This wasn't just about possession, it was a public spectacle, a final act of humiliation for the defeated. It was a way of showcasing their power and their ability to take not just a city's wealth, but its very soul. It's like a macabre historical fashion show, but the prize for the models is a life of servitude. Historians still argue whether the sexual violence perpetrated by the Mongols was a product of their nomadic, patriarchal culture, or if it was a deliberate, cynical military strategy. Was this a reflection of a society that viewed women as property, or was it a cold, calculated tactic to instill fear and prevent future rebellions? The answer is likely a grim combination of both. A society that was already pragmatic about relationships and war would have no qualms about using sexual violence as a tool. But the sheer scale and systematic nature of the violence suggests that it was more than just a cultural quirk. It was a fundamental part of the Mongol way of war. You can almost feel the terror, the despair, of the women caught in this brutal storm. You're walking through a city that was once vibrant and alive, and now it's a ghost town. You see the silent traces of the tragedy: a child's toy left in the street, a torn piece of cloth, a single shoe. The grand chronicles of the Mongol conquests are filled with tales of triumphant battles and brilliant strategies, but they are silent on the personal stories of the women who were caught in the crossfire. Their lives were a series of quiet tragedies, their names lost to history, their bodies treated as little more than chattel. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, the strange and unsettling thing that became a part of their world? This is a different kind of strangeness, the quiet, personal horror that was the daily reality for thousands of women. Genghis Khan's immense ambition had a price, and that price was paid not just in the blood of his enemies, but in the bodies and the dignity of the women he conquered. His legacy is not just one of a vast empire, but also of a vast unseen human toll. He may have created the largest land empire in history, but he did so by leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered families. His sexual practices, whether they were for political gain or personal desire, were a fundamental part of this process. The women he took were a constant living reminder of his power, but they were also the silent victims of his ambition. The stories of these women, the thousands of anonymous forgotten figures, are a powerful and necessary counterpoint to the grand narratives of conquest. They remind us that history is not just about the triumphs of powerful men, it is also about the quiet suffering of the people who are caught in their wake. The sexual toll of Genghis Khan's empire was a silent, pervasive horror that shaped the lives of countless women. They may not have left behind grand monuments or written chronicles, but their suffering is an indelible part of his legacy. And you, listening to this tale, are beginning to understand that the man who was so brilliant at building an empire was also a master of human destruction, and he did it with a chilling, ruthless efficiency that extended to the most intimate parts of human life. The wind is no longer just a cold messenger, it's a silent guardian, a conspirator in one of history's greatest secrets. We've talked about the public-facing aspects of Genghis Khan's life, the battles, the marriages, the empire building, but now we're going to delve into a mystery that has captivated historians and adventurers for centuries, the location of his burial site. You're no longer a spectator. You're moving through a landscape shrouded in rumour and ancient lore, a place where the women of his inner circle played a final, crucial role in ensuring his eternal rest remained undisturbed. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The location of Genghis Khan's tomb remains one of the most enduring mysteries in archaeological history. According to historical accounts, his funeral was a massive, highly secretive affair. To ensure that his burial site would never be found, the Mongols took extreme measures. The land was levelled, trees were planted, and a vast number of horses and people were reportedly killed and buried with him to obscure the trail. This act was not just about protecting the tomb from grave robbers. It was about ensuring that the sacred site of the Khan of Khans would forever be lost to the prying eyes of the outside world, preserving his eternal peace. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, one of the most persistent and macabre legends surrounding the burial is the 1,000 horse theory. The story goes that after the Khan was buried, 1,000 horsemen rode over the site to trample the earth, making it impossible to distinguish the grave from the surrounding landscape. Then, to ensure that no one would be able to return and reveal the secret, all of the people who knew the location of the tomb, including the soldiers who had buried him, were reportedly killed. This chilling story, while likely exaggerated, speaks to the immense paranoia and secrecy that surrounded the event. It's a bit like a historical version of a spy movie, with a final act designed to ensure that no one can ever talk. Historians still argue whether the extreme secrecy surrounding the burial was a genuine Mongol tradition, or if it was a final pragmatic act to prevent a defeated enemy from desecrating the tomb. Was this a deep-seated spiritual belief in the importance of an undisturbed final rest? Or was it a cold, calculated move to protect the legacy of their great leader? The debate centres on whether this was a matter of piety or a matter of military and political strategy. Given Genghis Khan's life, it's safe to assume it was probably both. A man who saw every aspect of his life as a strategic move would have seen his own death and burial as the final act of a long and brilliant campaign. You can almost feel the hush, the weight of the secret as you walk across the land. You see a quiet hill, a place that looks no different from any other in the vast expanse of the steppe. But you know that beneath this unassuming surface, one of the most powerful men in history is buried. His final resting place a mystery that has baffled scholars for centuries. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen, that strange little detail that revealed so much about their world? The secret of the tomb is the ultimate expression of that strangeness, a final, enigmatic act that tells us a great deal about the Mongol worldview. And this is where the women of his inner circle played their final crucial role. According to some sources, Genghis Khan's most trusted wives and concubines were the last to see his body, before it was sealed in the tomb. They, along with a few trusted generals, were the final guardians of the secret. They were entrusted with the sacred duty of ensuring that his final wishes were carried out and that his resting place would never be revealed. Their role was not just one of mourners, but of conspirators in the greatest secret in Mongolian history. Their loyalty was so profound, their position so trusted, that they were the last link to a secret that would be lost to time. The mystery of the tomb is a testament to the power of the women who guarded it. In a world where men made grand pronouncements and waged wars, it was the quiet, unseen loyalty of the women who ensured that the Khan's legacy would be preserved. Their role was not just one of a grieving widow, it was a sacred duty, a final act of devotion to the man who had brought them into his life, whether by force or by alliance. Their silent promise to keep the secret was an unbreakable bond, a final, unwritten pact that would be honoured for generations, and you, standing there in the silent expanse of the steppe, are beginning to understand that the women in Genghis Khan's life, from his first wife to his final confidants, were more than just his possessions. They were his most powerful allies, his most trusted advisors, and the ultimate guardians of his legacy. The Wind on the Steppe carries a new story now, one that speaks of a legacy that transcended a single lifetime. We've talked about Genghis Khan's life and his practices, but now we're going to explore how his descendants, his sons and grandsons, adopted and adapted his terrifying approach to power and relationships. You're no longer just a spectator. You're looking at a new generation of leaders, and you're starting to see how the sexual and political pragmatism of the Great Khan was passed down, becoming a core principle of the vast empire. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Genghis Khan's successors, the Great Khans and the rulers of the various Mongol hordes, continued and even expanded upon his practice of using marriage as a tool for conquest and control. They would marry women from the royal families of the kingdoms they conquered, not just to cement alliances, but to literally absorb the defeated dynasties into their own bloodline. The grandsons of Genghis Khan, like Kublai Khan, who founded the Yuan dynasty in China, and Hulagu Khan, who conquered the Middle East, amassed vast harems, each woman a living trophy of a new territory brought under their rule. This wasn't just a personal preference, it was a deeply ingrained political strategy, a way of signalling their absolute dominance over the defeated people. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the Mongols had a fascinating and deeply symbolic practice of naming their children after the tribes and peoples they had conquered. It was a way of literally internalizing their victories. For example, a son might be named after a defeated chieftain, or a daughter might be given the name of a conquered city. This practice, while appearing to be a form of tribute, was actually a profound act of psychological domination. It was a way of saying, we have not just defeated you, we have absorbed you, and your very name is now a part of our legacy. This custom was not just a historical footnote, it was a constant living reminder to the conquered peoples of their subordinate status. It's like a sports team naming its stadium after their biggest rival. It's a constant passive-aggressive reminder of their defeat. Historians still argue whether the sexual practices of Genghis Khan's descendants were driven by a genuine belief in the sacredness of the Mongol bloodline, or if they were merely a convenient justification for personal indulgence on a massive scale. Was this a genuine continuation of a political strategy, or did it devolve into a more hedonistic, less pragmatic approach to power? The debate centres on the motivations of these men. While Genghis Khan himself was known for his ruthless pragmatism and a singular focus on empire building, his descendants, with their vast wealth and power, had the luxury of a more lavish and less austere lifestyle. The vast harems of Kublai Khan, for example, were not just political tools, they were also a symbol of his immense wealth and power. You can almost feel the decadence, the sheer scale of it all, as you move through the royal courts of the great Khans. You're in a palace, not a simple yurt, and you see women from every corner of the known world, from China, from Persia, from Russia, all of them brought here to serve the will of a single man. The air is thick with the scent of foreign perfumes and exotic spices. The women are no longer just rivals for power, they're also objects of a new kind of competition, a competition of beauty and allure. The fierce, practical world of the steppe has been replaced by a new, more refined but equally ruthless world of imperial politics. Remember the quiet tensions of Genghis Khan's camp. This is that same tension, but magnified 1,000-fold. A vast, silent drama played out on a global scale. The grandchildren of Genghis Khan inherited not just an empire, but a way of a life, a worldview that saw relationships as a means to an end. They understood that the most effective way to rule a diverse, sprawling empire was not just with military might, but by subtly and systematically intertwining their bloodline with the defeated. This was their father's most enduring lesson, and they applied it with a chilling, ruthless efficiency. The stories of their conquests are filled with the same kind of brutal pragmatism that defined Genghis Khan's life. The women they took were not just personal possessions. They were a continuation of a long and bloody tradition of using the most intimate of human relationships as a tool of empire, and in a darkly humorous way, their inherited desires and practices led to one of the most remarkable phenomena in human history: the widespread distribution of Genghis Khan's Y chromosome. The sexual legacy of these men was so profound that it can still be traced in the DNA of millions of people across Asia and beyond. Their personal lives, their most private acts, had a global impact, a silent, unseen conquest that was far more lasting and pervasive than any battle they ever fought. You're beginning to understand that the grandchildren of Genghis Khan were not just heirs to an empire. They were the living embodiment of a legacy that was as terrifyingly sexual as it was political. The wind is no longer just a cold breath. It's a storyteller, and the tales it carries now are laced with both truth and hyperbole. We've talked about the verifiable facts of Genghis Khan's life, but now we must confront the myths that have grown around him, particularly those related to his sexual practices. You're no longer just a spectator. You're standing at the crossroads of history and legend, and you're starting to see how a man's personal life can be twisted, exaggerated, and sensationalized by the very people he conquered, turning him into a monstrous, almost superhuman figure. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The most sensational stories about Genghis Khan's private life come from the chronicles of his enemies and the romanticised accounts of later historians. For example, the famous claim that he fathered a child in every city he conquered is not supported by any credible historical record. While he did have many children with his numerous wives and concubines, the idea of him being a kind of roving, hyper-procreative machine is a product of a combination of fear and exaggeration. His enemies, particularly the Persians and the Chinese, had every reason to portray him as a brutal and indiscriminate monster, and his sexual appetites were a convenient and effective way to do so. The legends served a purpose. They demonized the conqueror and justified the hatred and fear of the conquered. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, one of the most persistent legends is the story of Genghis Khan's virgin tax. According to some, he would demand a rite of first night from every conquered village, an act of ritualistic sexual humiliation. However, there is no credible historical evidence to support this claim. This story, which also appears in the histories of other conquering empires, is likely a folkloric trope, a common narrative used to vilify an enemy. It's the kind of story that gets passed down through generations, growing in the telling, becoming a part of the collective memory of a people who have suffered a great trauma. It's a bit like a historical ghost story, with Genghis Khan as the terrifying apparition. Historians still argue whether the historical records, particularly those from the defeated empires, can be trusted at all when it comes to Genghis Khan's private life. Were these chroniclers telling the truth, or were they writing propaganda? The debate centres on how to separate the facts from the fiction, in a world where history was often written by the victors or the deeply biased. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While the Mongols were undeniably brutal, their enemies had every reason to exaggerate their cruelty. The stories of sexual violence and indiscriminate procreation, while having a basis in reality, were likely inflated to create a more terrifying and more effective narrative of the Khan as a force of nature, a kind of unstoppable, biological plague. You can almost feel the weight of these legends as you sift through the ancient manuscripts. You see the elaborate, often fantastical illustrations of a monstrous figure on horseback, a man who is not quite human. He is a symbol of absolute power, and his sexuality is portrayed not as a personal attribute, but as a kind of demonic force, a tool of his conquest. The stories of his sexual practices are not just about what he did, they're about what people believed he was capable of doing. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? The legends of Genghis Khan are a different kind of strangeness, the strange and unsettling ways in which we, as human beings, turn our enemies into monsters. The exaggeration of Genghis Khan's sexual practices served a dual purpose. For the conquered, it was a way of making sense of their suffering. He was not just a great military leader, he was a kind of anti-Christ, a force of chaos and destruction. His sexuality, as portrayed in these legends, was a symbol of his ability to dominate and to corrupt. For the Mongols themselves, the legends may have served to enhance his mythic status. A man who was capable of such a thing was not just a king or an emperor. He was a being of a different order, a man with a divine right to rule the world. The legends, whether true or not, added to his mystique and his power. The story of Genghis Khan's private life is not just a historical narrative, it's a lesson in how history is written, and how our fears and our prejudices can shape the way we remember the past. The truth is often far more complex and far more human than the legends would have us believe. The women in his life were not just passive victims, they were political pawns, powerful matriarchs, and secret agents of revenge. The man himself was not a mindless monster. He was a brilliant, ruthless, and deeply pragmatic leader who used every tool at his disposal, including his own sexuality, to build an empire. And you, listening to this tale, are beginning to see that the greatest conquests are not just on the battlefield, they are in the stories we tell ourselves about the past. The wind now carries a different kind of story, Not from dusty scrolls or whispered legends, but from the cold, hard logic of science. We've talked about the political and legendary aspects of Genghis Khan's personal life, but now we're going to explore the most profound and lasting testament to his sexual practices, his genetic legacy. You're no longer just a spectator, you're looking at a map of human DNA, and you're beginning to see how the actions of a single man in the 13th century can still be traced in the genes of millions of people today. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. A 2003 genetic study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that a significant portion of the male population in a vast swathe of Asia and beyond shares a common Y chromosome, and that this lineage can be traced back to a single ancestor who lived approximately 1,000 years ago. The geneticists who conducted the study concluded that the most likely candidate for this ancestor was Genghis Khan himself, or a male relative from his immediate family line. This is a staggering discovery, a kind of biological fingerprint left by a man who lived centuries ago. The study estimated that this lineage is present in about 8% of the male population living in the region of the former Mongol Empire, which translates to roughly 16 million men alive today. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The study's authors theorised that the sheer scale of this genetic legacy was not just a result of Genghis Khan's own procreation, but also of a phenomenon known as founder effect, combined with the Mongols' ruthless sexual practices. The Mongol elite, including the Khan's sons and grandsons, were incredibly successful in passing on their genes. As they conquered new territories, they would take women and have children, and their male descendants would go on to do the same. This created a kind of genetic chain reaction, a rapid and widespread proliferation of a single lineage across a vast geographical area. It's like a genetic version of a fast-spreading virus, only instead of a disease, it's a Y chromosome. Historians still argue whether the genetic evidence is definitive proof of Genghis Khan's sexual practices, or if it is simply a reflection of the brutal realities of war and conquest in the medieval period. Was the genetic dominance of this lineage a direct result of Genghis Khan's actions? Or was it a product of a more widespread practice of powerful men having numerous children with many women? The debate is whether this phenomenon is unique to Genghis Khan, or if it is a more general trend that was simply amplified by his immense power and the vastness of his empire. The fact that the lineage is so widespread and so concentrated in the regions of the former Mongol Empire, however, makes the Genghis Khan theory the most compelling one. You can almost feel the weight of this discovery as you look at the genetic map. You see the silent, unseen legacy of a man whose life was built on conquest and procreation. The stories of the women we've talked about, the wives, the concubines, the victims, are now given a new and powerful context. Their lives, their stories and their DNA were all a part of a single, grand, terrifying experiment in human dominance. The science tells us what the historical records can't, that the sexual toll of Genghis Khan's empire was not just a historical footnote, it was a biological reality, a silent conquest of the human genome. Remember the story of Berta and her abduction. The genetic legacy we are now talking about is the ultimate, almost ironic, culmination of that initial trauma. A man who was once so humiliated by the loss of his wife and the uncertainty of his son's paternity would go on to father a lineage that would be one of the most widespread in human history. His personal insecurity, his drive for power, and his ruthless pragmatism all came together to create a legacy that transcended the boundaries of his own life. The DNA is the final, unassailable proof of his terrifying ambition. The women in his life were not just political pawns or silent victims, they were the conduits of his legacy. Through them, his genes were passed down, and his bloodline, once a fragile and uncertain thing, became a permanent fixture on the human genetic map. The science reminds us that the most personal of human acts can have the most profound and far-reaching consequences. Genghis Khan's sexual practices were not just a part of his story, they were a fundamental part of the story of humanity itself. His was a life of conquest, but his most enduring conquest was a silent biological one. And you, listening to this tale, are now seeing that the history of this man is literally written in the genes of millions of people across the world. The wind has an echo in it now, a sound that is both haunting and unending. We've talked about Genghis Khan's life, his practices, and his genetic legacy, but now we must confront the final silent story of his conquests, the lingering echoes left on the women who were caught in his wake. You're no longer just a spectator. You're standing in the silent spaces of history, and you're beginning to understand that the impact of his sexual practices was not just a historical event. It was a deeply personal and generational trauma that shaped the lives of countless women and their descendants. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The sexual violence and forced marriages of the Mongol conquests had a lasting and profound impact on the societies they conquered. For the women who survived, life was often a brutal negotiation of power and survival. They were forced to live with the men who had destroyed their families and their homes, and they were expected to bear their children. This created a new kind of family dynamic, one built on a foundation of fear and subjugation. The children of these unions, the new generation of Mongols, were often caught between two worlds, the world of their nomadic fathers and the world of their conquered mothers. This duality created a new kind of cultural tapestry, a blend of Mongol ruthlessness and the traditions of the defeated. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, the children of these unions were often caught in a kind of identity crisis. They would speak the language of their mothers, know their traditions, and feel a kind of filial loyalty to their people, but they were also raised by their Mongol fathers, taught to be ruthless warriors, and taught that their loyalty was to the Khan. This created a fascinating and deeply unsettling psychological landscape. In a darkly humorous way, the Mongols were a kind of cultural melting pot, but the melting was done by force, and the pot was a pressure cooker of conflicting loyalties and identities. This silent internal struggle for identity was a part of the daily reality for thousands of people across the empire. Historians still argue whether the cultural assimilation that occurred in the Mongol Empire was a sign of the Mongols' adaptability, or if it was a final insidious form of conquest. Was the adoption of foreign traditions and the integration of conquered peoples a sign of the Mongols' open-mindedness, or was it a form of cultural erasure, a way of diluting and ultimately destroying the identity of the defeated? The debate centres on the motivations of the conquerors. While the Mongols were known for their willingness to adopt new technologies and ideas, the process of cultural exchange was far from equal. The Mongols were always the ones in power, and the conquered were always the ones who had to adapt. The quiet stories of the women who carried their cultural traditions forward, teaching their children their language and their stories in secret, are a testament to their resilience in the face of this assimilation. You can almost feel the weight of this unending echo. You're standing in a village, years after the conquest, and you see a woman, her face lined with the memory of a trauma that she will never speak of. She's raising a child who has the eyes of his Mongol father, but the spirit of his mother's people. The love she has for her child is a complex and contradictory thing, a blend of fierce protectiveness and a quiet, aching sorrow. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen, that strange and unsettling detail that revealed so much about their world? The unending echo of conquest is a different kind of strangeness. The quiet, generational trauma that is passed down, not through genes, but through stories and memories that can never be fully erased. The sexual toll of Genghis Khan's empire was not just a one-time event. It was a wound that never fully healed. The stories of the women who were caught in his wake are a powerful and necessary reminder that history is not just about the triumphs of powerful men. It is also about the quiet suffering of the people who are caught in their wake. The forced unions, the psychological trauma, and the cultural conflicts that resulted from these practices were a silent and pervasive horror that shaped the lives of countless individuals. The women who survived became a kind of living library of their people's history, their memories a constant, quiet reminder of what was lost. Genghis Khan's ambition was so vast that it transcended his own life. The consequences of his actions, both military and personal, are still with us today, in the form of a genetic legacy and a cultural memory that is still trying to make sense of the trauma. The unending echo of his conquests is a testament to the fact that the most personal of human acts can have the most profound and far-reaching consequences. The women of his empire, though their stories are often forgotten, are an essential part of his legacy. Their quiet suffering, their fierce resilience, and their unending sorrow are a powerful reminder that history is not a story of conquest alone, but a story of human struggle and survival. And you, listening to this tale, are now seeing the full, terrifying scope of a man who was not just a conqueror of lands, but a conqueror of hearts, minds, and generations. The wind on the steppe whispers a new story now, one of inherited power and cunning. We've talked about Genghis Khan's personal life and his legacy, But now we're going to explore how his sons and grandsons, the new generation of rulers, continue to use marriage and women as a tool for political consolidation. You're no longer just a spectator. You're moving through the new, expanded empire, and you're starting to see how the wives of these men wielded a different kind of influence, a silent power that shaped the destiny of entire nations. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The wives of Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons often came from conquered royal families and played a crucial role in the administration and governance of the new territories. Unlike the women of Genghis Khan's time, who were often caught in a nomadic, fast-moving war camp, these women were now living in settled, established courts. This gave them a new kind of power, the power of a regent, a diplomat, and a cultural bridge. They were the ones who often managed the relationships between the Mongol rulers and the conquered people, using their knowledge of local customs and languages to prevent rebellion and maintain order. The wives of the next generation were not just symbols of conquest. They were active participants in the process of state building. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The wives of the Mongol emperors, particularly in the Yuan dynasty in China, were often given immense wealth and administrative power. They had their own lands, their own revenues, and their own courts. Some of them, like Chabi, the favourite wife of Kublai Khan, were known for their generosity and their patronage of the arts and sciences. Chabi was instrumental in convincing Kublai Khan to adopt a more lenient and benevolent policy toward the Chinese population, arguing that a ruler who won the hearts of his people was more powerful than one who ruled by fear. This was a radical departure from the brutal pragmatism of Genghis Khan, and it shows the immense silent influence of these women. It's like a historical version of a modern-day First Lady, but with actual administrative power and the ability to change the course of history. Historians still argue whether the increased power and influence of these women was a sign of a new, more progressive Mongol culture, or if it was simply a strategic move by the male rulers to delegate administrative duties to trustworthy family members. The debate is whether this was a genuine cultural shift or a clever political tactic. The truth is likely a combination of both. As the Mongol Empire grew and became more sedentary, the old nomadic ways of life were no longer practical. The men were busy with military campaigns and long-distance trade, and they needed reliable administrators to manage the affairs of state. The women, with their intelligence and their loyalty, were the perfect candidates. Their power, while still tied to their husbands, was very real and very significant. You can almost feel the presence of these powerful women. You're walking through a grand palace in China, and you see a woman, not on a battlefield, but in a quiet, beautiful garden. She's not wielding a sword, but she's holding a scroll and a brush, and she is making decisions that will affect the lives of millions of people. She's a queen, a diplomat, and a cultural patron, all in one. Her life is a world away from the dusty yurts of her grandmother, but her power is no less profound. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? This is a different kind of strangeness. The quiet, almost unsettling realization that the brutal world of Genghis Khan gave birth to a new kind of power, a power that was wielded with intellect and grace, not with force. The women of the next generation, the wives of the sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan, inherited a legacy of brutal pragmatism, but they adapted it to their new circumstances. They understood that in a settled, complex empire, a ruler needed more than just military might. They needed the loyalty of their people, a stable economy, and a rich culture. These women, with their quiet intelligence and their fierce ambition, were the ones who provided it. They were the ones who ensured that the empire, which was built on conquest and bloodshed, had a chance to survive and to thrive. The stories of these women are often a footnote in the grand chronicles of the Mongol Empire, but they are an essential part of the tapestry of its success. They remind us that history is not just made on the battlefield, it is also made in the quiet, unseen spaces where true power is often found. They were the ones who managed the cultural exchange, who ensured that the traditions of their people were not completely lost in the face of Mongol domination. Their quiet work, their unseen influence, was as much a part of the Mongol legacy as the thunder of the cavalry, and you, listening to this tale, are now seeing the full majestic scope of a man who was not just a warrior, but also a master of using the most personal of relationships to build the largest land empire in history. The wind on the steppe has fallen quiet now. The sounds of battle and the whispers of intrigue have faded, and we're left with the stillness of a vast, empty landscape. we've journeyed through the terrifying and complex world of Genghis Khan's sexual practices, from the brutal pragmatism of his first marriage to the scientific legacy that still echoes in the genes of millions of people today. You're no longer a spectator. You're standing in the final moments of our story, and you're beginning to understand that the man whose name strikes fear and awe into the hearts of millions was not just a warrior, but a master of a different kind of conquest, the conquest of hearts, minds, and generations. We've seen how his personal life was inextricably linked to his political ambition. His first wife, Berta, was not just a partner, but a symbol of his vulnerability and his ultimate triumph. The abduction of his new bride taught him a hard lesson, that to be truly powerful, he had to possess everything his enemies held dear, and that included their women. This trauma, this profound humiliation, was the seed from which his terrifying sexual practices grew. The women he took from conquered lands were not just spoils of war, they were living trophies, a constant, silent reminder of his absolute dominance. The harem he built was not a place of idle pleasure, but a political map of his empire, with each woman representing a new territory brought under his control. It was a brilliant, if brutal, way of consolidating power and ensuring his bloodline's continuation. We also saw how the women of his court were not just passive possessions. The wives who ruled the roost, like the cunning Yasui and the politically savvy Chabi, were powerful figures in their own right. They were diplomats, administrators, and advisors, and they used their influence to shape the destiny of the empire from within. Their intelligence and their ambition were as much a part of the Mongol legacy as the thunder of the cavalry. We looked at the dark underbelly of this world, the silent vengeance of the conquered, the subtle betrayals, and the immense human toll of his empire building. We saw how the lives of countless women were shattered, their bodies treated as little more than chattel, their stories lost to history. But we also saw their fierce resilience, their quiet defiance, and their ability to survive and to protect their children in a world of unimaginable horror. And finally, we saw the most profound testament to his life, his genetic legacy. The scientific evidence that a significant portion of the male population in Asia shares his Y chromosome is a powerful and unsettling reminder that the consequences of his actions were not just historical, they were biological. The silent, unseen conquest of the human genome is his most enduring legacy, a silent, unassailable proof of his terrifying ambition. The sexual practices that we have explored, whether for political gain or personal desire, were a fundamental part of a process that shaped the story of humanity itself. But now it's time to let the grand drama of Genghis Khan's life fade into the quiet background of your mind. Let the sounds of the cavalry and the whispers of the court dissolve into the stillness of the night. The stories of power and conquest, of love and betrayal, are now a part of your memory. A tapestry of human history that is both beautiful and deeply flawed. Take a moment to just breathe, to let your body soften into the comfort of your bed. The journey is over, and the echo of the steppe wind is just a gentle hum in the quiet of your room. The Great Khan is a part of the past, and you are a part of the present, safe in the stillness of your home. The stories we've shared tonight, though they may seem distant and ancient, are a reminder that the most personal of human acts can have the most profound and far-reaching consequences, and that history, in all its complexity, is always with us. So, close your eyes now. Let your thoughts drift away like clouds on a calm evening sky. There's nothing left to do but rest.